But Nicole Witham, who is just standing up over here, just closest to me, is the statewide coordinator for the WSU Food Systems Program. And she also has a small-scale diversified livestock farm in Chimacum, Washington, focused on holistically managed pastured dairy and meats. And Nicole is going to moderate the panel with 3 farmers who've taken time out of their busy schedules to come and share with us their experience around closing the loop and the role of animal agriculture in regenerative agriculture. And you'll recall that we've been sort of teeing this session up with an introduction to soils, an introduction to regenerative agriculture, and now we'll talk about the role of animals, which is a very important topic in today's world. And I'm just delighted to pass it over to Nicole and to the farmers. Please join me in warmly welcoming them, and we'll get started.
Thank you, everybody. Can you hear me okay? In advance there, okay.
And this should be...
Go on full screen mode here.
Yes, here we go.
All right, everyone. Well, thank you very much for having me and our distinguished guests. It is a big deal to have 3 farmers come into the city and do this, so I hope that everyone can show them a lot of gratitude and some big smiles throughout the day as we leave today. Again, my name is Nicole Witham. As Yona said, I'm with the WSU Food Systems Program, and we're going to go through some intros to get started. First, I'm going to talk a little bit just about myself and our food systems program at WSU, and do some quick intros with our farmers, and then we're going to just set the stage, getting a little bit deeper into some information about regenerative animal agriculture. The scene has been very well set by the other lecturers in this seminar. I've watched some of the other videos and some of the other things that you guys have been learning, so we've been teed up well. So a little bit about me. Yona just mentioned I am a diversified livestock farmer myself. I say that this WSU gig is my grown-up job to support my farming habit. I raise heritage breed pigs, which you can see up there. That's me hugging one of my sows, Scarlet, and that is one of her litters of piglets. That's 14 piglets live, which is a big deal for a sow. We also raise a herd of dairy goats and meat goats. So we milk the does that are dairy does, and we breed them back to a meat breed buck, and then we raise those babies for meat in a regenerative system. This other picture is me schmoozing with the director of the WSDA and some vice presidents from WSU. So the food systems program is fairly new. It actually grew out of our small farms program at WSU. And I like to say this list you can see on the right-hand side should really be like a circle or a web. It's in no way hierarchical. It's in no way in this order. But all of these elements touch one another, and I think that's probably what you're learning in a lot of your food systems work. So we endeavor to do a lot of things throughout the state, one of which is the WA Meetup, and that's kind of one of the reasons we ended up here today. So our program developed WA Meetup as a brand and an event opportunity to bring producers like these guys that are here now together, along with processors, restaurateurs, regulators, basically another opportunity for transdisciplinary connection to help our small and niche meat producers in Washington state. So back in August, we had a summit here in Seattle. We actually hosted it at the Seattle Culinary Institute, Culinary Academy. Along with some field trips that we did throughout the day, one of which is we went to Jubilee with David, and he'll be able to introduce himself and say a little bit more. But I wanted you guys to know that this is some of the interesting work that our program's doing, and it's led to us being here today to lecture to you guys. So I'm going to hand it off to David with Jubilee Farm. He's checking out which pictures I stole offline to make sure that they're appropriate. But David, could you just take a moment to introduce yourself, your farm, and what it is that you produce? And you've got about 3 minutes, David. We're going to keep this going.
3 minutes. Yes, my name's David, and I own Jubilee Farm out in Snoqualmie Valley in Carnation. I'm a second-generation farmer. My wife and I bought it from my dad last year. We do a lot of different things. Our main business is mixed vegetables. vegetable CSA, so we do fruit, grain, and vegetable CSA year-round. But our big thing is the summer vegetables, and so that's like a 20-week program, which people buy directly from us. We also raise meat, beef, pork, lamb, poultry for both meat and eggs. And I really like that picture of me right there, and that one. I broke my hand the previous day, and I didn't know it at that point, but it really hurt. So every time I see that picture, I just think about how much my hand hurt. Anyway, that's us letting the cows out of the barn, and we'll be doing that again in the spring. And yeah, I guess that's all I really need to say.
Yeah, you'll get to say more. And did you say where you're located?
Snoqualmie Valley, so that's about 20 miles east as the crow flies.
Thank you. And Matthew.
Hi, I'm Matthew Cox. I own and operate Greenbow Farm out in Ellensburg, Washington. We are a 56-acre grass farm, essentially. We raise 56 acres of pasture. There's some civil pasture involved as well. And we do grass-fed and finished beef on a rotational schedule. We do pasture-raised pork. We do pasture-raised chicken and pasture-raised eggs. I'm a first-generation farmer. It's not my first farm, though. We actually bought a farm, 20 acres, started there, turned it into a farm business, moved to farm, which was a learning experience, and got started in the new location. So I've been at it now for about 8 years.
Thank you. And Mericos.
My name is Mericos Rhodes, co-founder at Spoonful Farm. There's me holding a piece of cow manure about 3 years ago that I was kind of celebrating the fact that cows were dropping manure on the land because we converted a hay farm that had been growing hay conventionally for 35 years and brought the animals back on and are kind of working to restore the soil. And Spoonful is about, we're actually Matt's neighbor outside of Ellensburg, just east of the mountains. So it's hot, dry, cold, windy, sunny over there. And we have cattle, we have chickens that we raise on pasture as well for eggs. And we have a big garden and we make hot sauce. So lots of fun.
So I'm just going to set the scene a little bit for you guys. We're going to get a chance to talk a little bit more about why animals are important in these systems. And where I'd like to start is soils and grasslands before colonization. So I kind of like to ask everyone to almost take a moment in your mind. You may not be from the Pacific Northwest. You may be from somewhere completely different in the world, but just take a moment to imagine what this landscape around us or even east of the mountains may have looked like before humans, and excuse me when I say humans, I mean colonists showed up in this area. And this may be what it looked like. This may still be what it looks like in some areas. But what is important about that is that herds of wild creatures used to roam these lands freely, right? There weren't fences. There weren't people moving them. They moved with the seasons. They moved with the weather. They moved with resources. They may have moved when they were being hunted either by predators or other indigenous people. But they were the ones that laid the groundwork for the soils that we now utilize today. And I know, where's Sarah? Is Sarah Collier in here somewhere? There she is. Sarah and when they talked about soils in their lecture, they said some similar things. You know, you hear about the Dust Bowl and you hear about these areas where we had huge amounts of topsoil and organic matter, foots and foots deep. And we, in a matter of less than 100 years, were able to deplete those soils, right? And mainly by a certain type of agriculture. So I just like everyone to take a moment to kind of envision what our world would look like if we still had animals interacting with our landscapes. There's some really important things that happen when they do interact with our landscapes. There's a symbiotic relationship that grazers have with the lands that they're on. When I use the term ruminant, does everyone in this room know what that means? Anyone? A little bit? Ooh. Okay, so are these most like health, nutrition all over the board, right? So we have some health and nutrition majors here? No? Oh, one, okay. Well, okay, here's a very simple diagram of a cow, and this is just one animal. There's other animals that are ruminants, like goats, but they have a big old fermentation tank on board. And when they eat cellulose and other grassy or woody matter, they have the ability to break it down in their gut, unlike us. So if I eat grass, you know, people think taking wheatgrass shots is like really hot, like it's the cool thing to do nowadays. That might be really good for you, but we don't have the systems on board to process grass. And where does grass or pasture or perennial systems like this grow? They'll grow pretty much anywhere. So we have the opportunity to utilize this onboard fermentation tank to restore some of these ecosystem functions. And they do that pretty simply. They take a bite from the top, above ground, and then what happens below ground? The roots of that same grass below ground die off. About the same amount that was taken off the top, not all of them. So when those roots die off, they send a signal, they deposit nutrients, they actually help that grass to grow more, as long as that ruminant or that animal is still moving and doesn't come back for a second bite and a third bite and a fourth bite. So that's why animals are really important in being able to manage these systems. They really and truly were meant to do it. And we kind of just screwed it up when we decided to take them off of the land or move them along. So this is where we're at now. And I put some kind of like, I could have gone way more, you know, these aren't totally horrific images, but it gives you the sense of what we're talking about now. Confined animal feedlots, or CAFOs, do folks, you guys know that terminology? So confined animal feedlots is like what we're seeing here in this image. And I can guarantee you each of these three fellows that are here do not farm in this way. But this is where animals are penned up and kept close together. Their manure is not being deposited as they graze or as they move. Manure is a good thing. I know we often hear when it comes to climate change that cows are the ones that are, it's something like 15, just under 15% of the carbon emissions being let is because of cows. But think about this. These are not cows that are grazing in grass and depositing manure, and then that manure isn't becoming fertilization. This is too much. Above is a barley field in eastern Washington, another monoculture. So we've taken the animals off of, so, you know, imagine if these cows were grazing in that field. What would they be doing? Depositing manure, fertilizing, trampling stubble. But instead we've taken them off and we've mechanized everything. So what we are here to talk about today is a more regenerative type of agriculture, which includes animals. This is some information from a fellow farmer in Georgia. He actually converted a very large conventional farm into a diversified livestock farm using holistic grazing management practices. And now, after doing some third-party research, actually taking it upon himself to do this research, and let me preface this by saying, yes, I do come from a land-grant university. We are not doing this type of research yet. Much of the information that I even had to bring you today is coming from folks in Michigan State University, Texas A&M. So there are people out there doing it, but it's a pretty complicated thing to research. We do have folks that are doing research in cover crops and other sustainable production methods, but it's really, really hard to find a researcher who's doing something where they're tracking the integration of animals into a production system. But here on this farm, they were able to prove that their cows are actually sequestering more carbon than they will ever emit in their lifetime. And I just think that that's kind of an important nugget to take away. This is also about the management that they used. It's not just letting cows roam free wherever or penning them up and feeding them a certain diet. So, a big kind of controversial question right now is this whole meat thing. I think a lot of you maybe listen to the radio, you watch some news. Maybe a few months ago you heard about a report that came out that said the biggest thing that you can do to influence or impact climate change is to stop eating meat. Did anybody hear about that report or hear any news stories? Or maybe when they were burning the forests in Brazil, that they said, okay, everybody stop eating meat, stop eating beef, right? So that's kind of what we're here to dig into a little bit today is there's always a paradox, right? There's always a do it all the way like this or a do it all the way like that. We're here to talk today about what you can do in the careers that you go forward in as a consumer and how you can make informed decisions. And I was just talking about research a second ago. I really like this quote. This is from Jason, like I said, a researcher at Michigan State University. And I think he puts it well. Oftentimes, university academics or others that are in the research field can get very siloed. It's really easy to just look at one very specific thing. And when it comes to integrating animals on land and managing them for soil health, it's a super complex system, right? You're not just managing, and Sarah's over here chuckling, you're not just trying to track one thing in that research project, right? It gets infinitely more complicated. So that's why there's not a lot of it going on. But with that being said, I wanted for you all to have the opportunity to hear from some producers and hear their stories as to why they chose to be livestock producers, how it's influenced their lives, how it's influenced their soil, and how it's beginning to influence their consumers. Let me see what else I have on here. I can't remember. Okay. Yeah, big old follow us at, but let's just take it back to a pretty picture here to rest on. So that there we go. So with that being said, I'm gonna come over here. And before we hop into the panel portion of this, does anyone have any questions?
I have a question.
Sure.
Is there anybody in here who is or was a vegetarian? Matt? Yeah, cool. I know you will. All right, me too. Just saying.
That's one of our favorite questions to ask when we talk about this, by the way. So we noticed that a lot of folks that may have come from a vegan or vegetarian background eventually find their way to regenerative meats. So I'm going to kick things off, and I might ask all of you to answer some things. I might ask just one of you to answer some things. We might ask some stuff of you, the audience, but we want to just dig into this topic a little bit more. So, Mericos, you kind of just hinted that you were a vegan or a vegetarian at one point?
Both.
Both? Okay. Both and. Can you just share your story about how you made your way to wanting to become a livestock producer and what that meant to you?
Sure. So I was vegan for a while. I watched movies about CAFOs and the impact of meat on climate change and water quality and all of these kind of horrific situations in which most of the meat that's consumed in the world now is raised, and it's atrocious. So it hit me on an emotional level and on an intellectual level that I can't just unconsciously eat whatever meat or eggs or milk comes up in front of me, because the consequences of that can be terrible. And I was in college, and I was lucky enough to go to a guest lecture by a farmer named Joel Salatin, who he's in the movie Food Inc., if you've seen that movie, which if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. But he's in there, and he's the one who's talking to his pigs. He's talking to his pigs, and they're having a good time. It's just a beautiful scenario. He came to my college, and compared to my professors, he was like, 500-watt light bulb and running back and forth on stage yelling about soil carbon in the Great Plains and talking about how tillage and monocultures have devastated biodiversity, but we could bring it back and solve climate change with cows. And it was kind of like a cup to the ear from the world, being like, this is so much more complex than you gave it credit for. And so I started looking into it and basically moved to a farm as soon as I could down in Oregon. And I grew up in Seattle, like a mile from here. Never thought I would be a farmer growing up. It wasn't even on my top 10 list of professions, probably.
And you did gravitate towards livestock farming, and at that point, were you eating meat? Did you begin to eat meat once you were raising it yourself? When did you make that shift?
Yeah. As right after seeing Joel Salatin, I think the next day, I just Googled grass-fed beef in the region where my college was, and found a small producer there, and bought some beef and kind of haven't looked back. But my principle now is essentially, if I'm going to eat any animal product, I have to know more or less exactly where it comes from and how it was raised and what the soil effects are of that animal being raised.
Awesome. With that, can you pass the mic down to David? So David from Jubilee, like he mentioned before, he does also grow a very wide variety of veggies, and then eventually integrated livestock. They weren't necessarily always a part of your system. And could you, and I might be, is that right? Is that correct?
Sure.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Can you say why you began to integrate them into your system, and once you did, what happened?
Right. Well, a lot of this has been said when you talked about Joel Salatin, and when you mentioned earlier in your slideshow about the large ruminant herds roaming North America and the kind of carbon sequestration that was going on and the building of soil health. When you look at nature, you never see just plants, you never see just animals, they go together. So if you want to build fertility on a farm, you've got to do it, there's a limited number of ways to do it. Probably the best way to do it is with a ruminant herd like cows. Cows are great, and they're easier to pen than sheep, and just a little strand of electricity keeps them in. So what we do is we kind of got the herd, and in some ways it's like, yeah, we sell beef, but the huge kind of stacked value to our beef herd is that we make a lot of compost, hundreds of tons of compost, and that's kind of what I do during the winter. Is I take care of the cow herd, and then I clean and I stack all their wasted bedding up high, aerate it. It comes into compost, and that stuff will literally become your cabbage and your carrots and your broccoli and all that kind of stuff. So you can grow lots of veggies, but there's also a big environmental cost to that as well, because you're having to buy in fertility, because nothing comes from nothing. Everything's got to come from somewhere. So we kind of split our farm to about 80 acres of pasture and about 20 to 30 acres of vegetables. And that seems to be a pretty good a pretty good match there. The fertility that we're kind of harvesting out of the pastures, we make in the compost, and then it kind of fuels the vegetable portion of our farm. Does that get what you were?
That was great. That was
Thanks.
beautiful. And I think it's really important to just note, we were just mentioning if you were a vegetarian, if you said, okay, well, my choice is going to be a vegetarian, and that's how I'm going to choose to vote with my dollar, so to speak. I think it still means you need to be aware that, and when I say NPK, you guys know what that, no? You don't, yeah. Soil scientists, you want to shout it out? NPK? Nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus. It comes from somewhere. It has to come from somewhere. So no matter what the crop is that you're growing, it needs those things. And most likely, even if you're a vegetarian, the vegetables that you're growing are most likely being fertilized with blood meal, feather meal, other things that came from animals, maybe manure, maybe a beautiful manure compost like what they're creating at Jubilee. But I just wanted to throw that in there. And with that, we'll switch to Matt. And Matt, kind of just like with what I just mentioned, Matt, you do a farmer's market, or number of farmer's markets.
Yeah,
is that correct?
We are more of a farmer's market farm.
So Matt gets exposed to a lot of consumers face to face, does a lot of customer servicing face to face, and when you're working with the public, what are some of the kind of most common misconceptions that you may hear or come across, or that maybe that people even ask you, like some questions that they ask you?
I'm often asked, do I raise these animals? Well, yes, this is a farmer's market. I'm a farmer, and here I am. Here we are together. I raise these animals, and I process these animals, and sell these animals to you, the end consumer. And a lot of people want to know, are they grass-fed and grass-finished? That's really important to people these days. And I always sense a lot of misconception about how that's done. A lot of people aren't aware that even cattle that are, grain-fed are raised on pasture most of their life. It's just the last few months if they go into a concentrated feedlot, right? Of course, we don't do that. We raise our animals on pasture, grass-finish them, haul them to the butcher, haul them back, haul them to the farmer's market, and sell them that way. But most people are very concerned about where their food is coming from and how it's being raised. Is the bottom of that. Is what I have to say about that.
Do they make any comments about your price point?
People are often very concerned about our price point. We have a fairly high price point. It's pretty expensive to do that birth to plate thing with animal production. We're paying for managing those animals for the duration of their life. In the case of cattle, it could be 26 months. We're taking care of the mamas, we're taking care of the babies, we're taking care of all those things throughout the year, and moving them and making sure they have water and making sure all of their needs are met. If you take care of your family, you're making sure there's a couple people in your household, that all their needs are met. Imagine doing that with hundreds of animals. We have to, for pigs and chickens. Chickens are really popular. Our eggs are really popular, and we have to haul in feed and pay for that feed. We have to raise those laying hens up for 6 months. As most of you know, that's an expensive venture, and we pay for all that and carry all that expense, and then bring the product to market. And in the case of pigs or chickens, we process those, package them, and then just take those to market. So we've got a lot of expense under our belt by the time that product actually hits the market. And so there's a pretty high price point to make it all work.
Yeah, and there's an economy of scale thing going on there. I think that's like one of the big takeaways I hope you all have is that there are different types of meat you can choose to buy, right? And so, please.
Well, I think if you look at conventional meat, it's artificially cheap. Basically, commodity corn and soy, which is grown transgenically and doused in herbicides, is heavily subsidized by the federal government, first of all. All the fossil fuels involved in creating the fertilizer is heavily subsidized by the federal government. And on top of that, they're cutting, conventional large-scale meat producers often cutting every possible corner as far as costs, using antibiotics, using these, what we saw earlier, those CAFOs where the manure is concentrated and becomes a biohazard. And so essentially, if you're buying cheap meat, you're adding to what are called the externalities, the externalized costs of that conventional meat production system, which is really a myth. An externality, it just means that we're going to pay the costs later, or poor people who are living near a chicken manufacturing plant will pay those public health costs in the form of poor air and poor water. So it's just basically, it's artificially cheap, and so if you really want to just pay for meat and not pay for environmental destruction, then it costs more, and so you probably eat a bit less meat, which is okay.
So one or both or all of you can take a stab at this, but how do you feel raising livestock and selling to consumers in this area? How does that feed into a healthy local regional food system in your mind? Anybody? We've got 20 minutes for an economics lecture.
Well, one thing is it's kind of hard to find the high quality meat. If you go to the farmer's market, you can find it, but not everyone is able to go to the farmer's market. So just providing access is a really important thing, because there are a lot of people, such as yourselves, who really care about climate change and want your own personal choices to reflect that care. So it's just important to make it available for people on one hand, and to support a family in the process.
Also, when you're shopping with and supporting local food systems, you're supporting those local farm families, and in addition to those local farm families, we're supporting having that agricultural land and those open spaces that around you and are in the area. If farmers not going to use it and turn it, and work that land, then it's probably going to go to housing. Somebody's going to take it up, and it's not going to be farmland anymore forever. So supporting your local food systems is important in that way. And it's also great to know where your food is coming from. You can ask those questions and visit those farms and see how those things are done. And soils from different areas produce meats of different flavor. Our meat tastes probably different from your meat. The one is better than the other, but the different characteristics in the soil, mineral content, and things like that, they all come through and show up in the finished product.
David, do you want to add a little touch about kind of just land access? Like he began to say, one of the big things is keeping land in ag, which you guys have had plenty of experience at.
Right. So sometimes people say, "I want to be a farmer," and I hear that, and I think that's great. The easiest way to become a farmer is to be born into a family that already has farmland, like I did. So y'all could just do that. You'll be set. And then I say, no, really, get a job in tech, get a lot of money, and then retire, and then buy a lot of farmland. Farmland's super expensive. It's like, really expensive. You can Google land that's 40 acres, great. There's no access roads. It's surrounded by a bunch of other. It's in a floodplain. Can't build on it. It's $20,000 an acre. You're like, wow, that's expensive for nothing. Land is really tricky in this area, and it's very expensive. Farming is traditionally a high capitally leveraged position with very low margins. You can see why a lot of people do want to sell out, but once you sell out and they put a target on your farmland, that target is never torn down and farmland never comes back. So it's a one-way street. They don't tear up freeways and plant trees. It's pretty much done when that happens. So it's important. And being a second-generation farmer, I've often thought of the argument of why is it important to keep we kind of have a nostalgic vision of farmer families, and they're keeping that kind of old rural tradition in America alive. Well, anywhere you come from in the world, there's probably a rural tradition. Most people are farmers in most places in the world for most of human history, so it kind of comes from that human tradition. At some point, there was a big switch in this country. It happened around World War II, where most people then lived in a city and not in the country, and now it's much, much more the other direction. So much more people live in cities than in the country, and so a lot of knowledge on the hands-on kind of stuff on how to farm has been lost. My dad, he bought the farm when he was 38 years old, having never farmed, and he had to learn a lot of things the hard way, which is basically by doing and failing, and then trying again. So there's a lot of hands-on knowledge. A lot of times we tend to think that knowledge and skills are cumulative, being well, we did it 100 years ago, it should be really easy now because we have iPhones. But it's not always that case, and knowledge that you gain kind of indirectly just by casual observation your whole life is really studied it. But I know how to farm really well on our little piece of land because I know the land really well. And every land is every piece of property is unique. It's got unique characteristics. They're like little micro environments and soil conditions that you got to know about and how to take advantage of.
That's okay. That's okay.
I'll stop.
Can you just say a bit about your agricultural easement and how you guys were able to do some succession within your family?
The easement?
Well, PCC
Oh, yes.
and
Yes. So I
you don't have to go really deep.
I'll
in,
I'll
keep
that
it
in
surface level.
mind.
Yeah.
I think it was which one of the tech companies was it? Was it Amazon? Anyway, someone wanted to build a really tall building in South Lake Union, right? And then they had to buy development rights from outside the city so they could develop the city bigger. And so they gave us money to develop farmland that we weren't going to develop anyway. So
To not develop farmland.
Yeah, to not develop. So now our land is protected. It's in the PCC Farmland Trust, so it will not be developed, which is great because it also provided some capital for us to build a new barn, which was really wonderful. And what was the other one you wanted me to touch on?
That's pretty much it. Just that there are modes. We're talking about that local food systems are not only important for providing food to our local communities, right? But it's also important to store and save lands, right? So if farmland that was traditionally being used all of a sudden isn't being used anymore and gets developed, like he was saying, it doesn't ever come back. The clock doesn't turn back the other direction. And so a really creative mode that some folks are using now is the purchasing of development rights. And so you may have heard of different land trusts, PCC farmland trusts. There's different county-based land trusts. And what they do is buy development rights off of certain parcels of land. They have to be a certain size and so on and so forth. And basically take away the opportunity to subdivide or develop that land. Often means they sell it at an agricultural value to a farmer as well. And there's some tricky stuff there, but I just thought that was valuable for you guys to know that a huge piece of all of this conversation is keeping more lands in active ag. If we could keep even more lands in integrated animal regenerative ag, then we're starting to sequester carbon.
Can I say one thing about the cheaper food? What the other farmer said was a really good point. I'd just like to say that the food has been made artificially cheaper, so like grass-fed beef is more expensive, but it's as a nation we used to pay more for food. It used to be a larger percentage of our budgets. So we're not making it more expensive. We're just making it back to what it used to cost. It's not like suddenly farmers got lazy and don't want to work as hard or have to I don't know. It's more like, hey, this is without all the price supports. This is what beef costs. People eat more beef now because it's cheaper. We worked really hard and burned a lot of fossil fuel to make it that cheap and made a lot of strange policies that are kind of odd to make this happen. And now we got to kind of undo a lot of that in a way that makes sense. We got to, we went a little nuts there for the last 100 years.
Yeah.
And we did some weird things as a nation as far as our farming policy goes.
So if you're into public health, you probably know this statistic that we spend more per capita on healthcare than any other country in the world, by double. And we spend less per capita on food than any other country in the world. I don't think that's a coincidence because food is medicine, medicine is food. And obviously the healthcare one is quite complex, but I think a big step we could take to actually fixing our healthcare system would be to fix our food system so that it was all medicine, basically. And these guys are growing medicine. We're growing medicine food. I mean, my life changed dramatically when I moved to a farm and started eating farm food. It's probably the single biggest change that I've experienced in my life, so I'd highly recommend it.
Can I ask, can we turn to the audience and after hearing this information or after going through this program, are any of you interested in, and I know you're like, I get it, we were all like poor college students at one point or another, right? Would any of you be willing to pay a little bit more for say one really nice steak or like one really nice meat item per week and then not have meat the rest of the week? Yeah, I see some yeah. Where can any of these folks find you guys? Where can they access you if they wanted to purchase your products? Quickly.
We have a booth at the Capitol Hill Farmers Market. And spoonfulfarm.com, full with 2 L's. And find us on Instagram too, at Spoonful Farm.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think.
Got lots of good products.
And Matt, where are you at?
We participated in the Westdale Farmers Market year-round, as well as the Magnolia Farmers Market. And we have a farm store on the farm that we sell out of. And there's always more information on our website, greenbowfarm.com.
Yeah, I mean, we're pretty close to the city. We're pretty fortunate that way. So we sell a lot of our meat, well, all of our meat directly to people. So yeah, our website is where you find us. And there's a lot of other people out there. We're not the only ones. And the thing is, if you don't, someone's got to kind of be the early adapter and do it. Otherwise, farmers that raise this kind of meat can't continue to do it. And
Yeah, so either you find some really fantastic people like this to start sourcing your food and meat from. I'm one of those crazy folks that just says, I'm just going to do it myself. I even do it with my own dairy now. That's how crazy I am. I milked a goat this morning before I got in the car to drive here from the Olympic Peninsula. That's how crazy I am about where my food comes from. So with that being said, I think we can, if there's any, even if Yona, if you have any questions or if anyone else has questions for us to.
So how do we move away from most like non-regenerative animal agriculture, and how do we make it easier for people who live in areas that are kind of secluded from those kind of purchasing options for regenerative animal agriculture, and how we make that more accessible for everyone, especially with people on a tight budget?
That is a really good question, and is a huge issue not only for regenerative animal ag, but also for basically good, healthy food in general. And we have heard the term food desert. I now like to call it food apartheid, because deserts are a naturally occurring system. But it's a very, very complicated thing. There are some options now where some counties and some government agencies are doing food stamps or WIC purchasing dollars that you can use at farmers markets. Do any of you have anything directly do any of you do anything that helps make your food more affordable or accessible?
When we participate in the farmers market systems, they do offer double your dollars on EBT stamps and things like, EBT. And then we do take EBT directly at our farm store. So, and just yesterday we donated almost 50 dozen eggs to our local food bank when we had an overage and running out of fridge space. So we do what we can to try to make it accessible to people, but we also need people who can afford our food to come and support us to keep us farming from year to year.
Here's another quick thing. I know this might sound a little bit crazy, but you guys have roommates? Any of you have roommates? Yeah? Get a freezer and buy in bulk with your friends. That's what a lot of these folks sell when they say they're selling directly to a customer or through a CSA. Most oftentimes, that's not 1 or 2 cuts at a time. That's like half an animal, a quarter of an animal. So get familiar with all the different cuts and bits and pieces of an animal. Don't think that you only get bacon from a pig. And if you can pool together enough funds and storage with a group of friends, you can have a lot of really good, high quality meat and feed yourselves for the whole year or half a year. And it's actually more affordable than buying it from the grocery store. It's just the fact that you have to be able to make that investment up front, but the per pound price will most likely be cheaper.
I was just going to say, to your question about where would you find things like that, if you live in a rural area, you just make connections with folks out there, and if you live in an urban area, there's got to be 50, 75 farmers markets in the Puget Sound area every weekend. They're pretty easy to find, and you can go and make relationships with all those farmers. There's 80 vendors at those farmers markets this time of year, and when June rolls around, there's even more. So, I mean, you can go and make personal relationships, figure out which farms you like and which farms you want to support. And
You can also work on a farm.
you can work on a farm.
You know, one of the things where this kind of, the green revolution of the 1920s to 80s, 90s, somewhere around then, it took a long time for this kind of commercial, industrial, agricultural to kind of take root. It's not going to be undone overnight. So you have to kind of say, and there's a pressure there, right? We've lowered the price of food, and we're saying, well, we've got to dial that back. And that makes a lot of people nervous, right? Because then there's this context of like, well, what about people who are already struggling to get food? You want to raise prices on them by going to this system where food is a lot more valuable? And yeah, that's a real concern. I'm not going to say that like, yeah, you know, the grass-fed beef right now is available for everybody and everybody should do it. We should be moving towards that. As we move towards industrial beef in the 1920s, we need to now take the foot off the gas at least and start moving in another direction. And one of the reasons industrial beef took hold was because it was supported financially by the federal government. So right now, you know, corn is subsidized, so when you drink Coke, you know, there is government funding for that, but if you buy broccoli from me, you got to pay market price. Okay? And that doesn't really seem fair. It doesn't really seem healthy. You know, we pay for bad food, and then we wonder why we're sick.
And this is where you're in the School of Public Health. So write letters to your legislatures, get involved, start to look at what's coming through as bills in the legislature. There was just a carbon bill that came through this year that you could be in support of. But yeah, it's not easy, and the access question is definitely not an easy one. But any other questions up here?
Yeah, how do you think the increase in popularity of plant-based meat substitutes, how do you think that's going to affect regenerative agriculture?
That's a good question. So his question was, how do we think plant-based meat products might affect regenerative agriculture? And that was one of my questions I didn't even ask, but does anybody want to say anything about plant-based meats?
You know, one of the when you measure how much kind of carbon a regular burger takes, there's a lot of carbon costs associated with meat. And when you look at industrial meat, what the cow is being fed is grain. And one of the biggest sources of carbon comes from grain is actually the tillage of the soil. So when you break the ground, the plow or disc or harrow or whatever, it releases carbon into the air. One thing's nice about grass-fed is that their soils isn't broken, and that the carbon stays in the ground. So every time that you plant a giant field of soybeans, you're breaking the ground before you do it. Now there are no-till farms, but a lot of times no-till relies on chemical kills to get rid of all the plant matter before you plant. So there's going to be a cost associated with everything. I think we like to think in terms of big solutions, like, well, if we transferred and started raising a few billion pounds of plant-based meat, then we'd shift away from all these carbon costs. But a lot of times problems are kind of not scalable in that way because land is unique and particular to climates that it's in. So what we need to do is think.
Do we get to keep talking?
No, just finish.
Oh,
Go ahead.
is that the bell?
Yes.
Wow, it's been so long. What we should be doing is thinking more about how we solve these things locally within a diverse community of land that is unique to the area.
And as I said earlier, NPK comes from somewhere. So even that plant-based meat took something to grow it and had carbon loss associated with it. Eat good meat. Eat good meat.